The old oak tree stood at the edge of Riverside Park, its massive trunk scarred by 2 centuries of weather and time, its branches reaching toward the sky like the arms of an ancient giant pleading for mercy. The tree had been there before the town of Willow Creek was founded, before the first settlers built their homes along the river that gave the community its name, before anyone living could remember a time when it wasn't part of the landscape.
It was a landmark, a meeting place, a symbol of everything that made Willow Creek the kind of town where people put down roots and stayed for generations. And for the past 3 weeks, it had been the home of a man named Harold Whitmore and his dog, a German Shepherd mix named Scout. Harold was 67 years old, a Vietnam veteran who had served 2 tours in the Mekong Delta before returning home to a country that didn't want to acknowledge what he had done or what he had sacrificed. He had spent the decades since trying to build a normal life, working construction jobs when his back would allow it, collecting disability when it wouldn't, living in a succession of apartments and rented rooms that never quite felt like home. His wife had left him in 1985, taking their daughter to California and cutting off all contact. His parents had died within a year of each other in the early 1990s, leaving him truly alone for the first time in his life. The descent into homelessness had been gradual, a slow slide that Harold barely noticed until he found himself sleeping in his car, then in shelters, then on the streets when even the shelters turned him away. The VA had programs, people told him, resources for veterans in his situation. But Harold had learned long ago not to trust the promises of institutions that had failed him before. He preferred to take care of himself, to find his own solutions, to maintain whatever shred of dignity he could hold on to in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. Scout had found him on a rainy night in Memphis, appearing out of the darkness like a ghost, pressing against Harold's side as if they had known each other for years. The dog was young then, maybe 2 or 3 years old, with the lean build and intelligent eyes of a working breed. No collar, no tags, no indication of where he had come from or who might be looking for him. Harold had tried to shoo him away at first, knowing that caring for a dog would make his already difficult life even harder. But Scout had refused to leave, had followed Harold wherever he went, had appointed himself guardian and companion with a devotion that brooked no argument. That had been 5 years ago. They had traveled together since then, moving from city to city, always staying one step ahead of the authorities who might separate them, always searching for a place where they could finally rest. Harold's health had deteriorated during those years, his back giving out completely after a bad fall, his lungs weakened by decades of cigarettes and exposure to Agent Orange during his military service. Some days, the only thing that kept him going was Scout, the loyal dog who had saved his life in ways that Harold could never fully articulate. They had arrived in Willow Creek a month ago, drawn by rumors of a town that was friendly to people like them, a place where the police didn't hassle the homeless and the community organizations provided genuine help rather than bureaucratic runaround. The rumors had proven partly true. The shelters were full, as they always were, but a church group provided hot meals twice a day, and the police had been surprisingly tolerant of Harold's presence, as long as he didn't cause trouble. The old oak tree had become their refuge, almost by accident. Harold had been looking for a place to sleep one night when he discovered that the tree's massive trunk had a hollow at its base, a cavity large enough for a man and his dog to shelter from the rain. It wasn't comfortable, wasn't warm, wasn't anything that a normal person would consider acceptable. But it was better than the alternatives, and it had a view of the river that reminded Harold of places he had been before everything went wrong. He had made improvements over the weeks, creating a sort of nest within the hollow, using cardboard and blankets donated by the church group. He had established a routine, walking Scout through the park in the early morning hours, then retreating to the tree during the day to avoid the families and joggers who might be disturbed by his presence. He tried to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to exist without bothering anyone. But the town had noticed him anyway, and the town had not been kind. It started with the children, as it often did. They would point and laugh as they passed, calling out names that Harold pretended not to hear. Their parents would hurry them along, shooting glances toward the old tree that mixed pity with disgust. The message was clear. You don't belong here. This is our park, our tree, our town. You are an intruder, an eyesore, a problem that someone really ought to do something about. The teenagers were worse. They would come at night sometimes, throwing rocks at the tree, shouting insults that echoed across the empty park. Harold had learned to stay silent during these attacks, to hold Scout back when the dog wanted to defend him, to wait until they got bored and wandered away. Fighting back would only make things worse, would give the authorities the excuse they needed to drive him out. He had learned that lesson long ago, in a country that had taught him many things about survival that he would rather have forgotten. The adults saved their mockery for social media, where Harold had become a recurring topic of discussion in the town's various Facebook groups. Someone had taken a photograph of him sleeping in the hollow of the tree, Scout curled at his side, and posted it with a caption that read, "Our town's newest attraction, the Tree Man of Willow Creek." The post had gone viral, at least by local standards, generating hundreds of comments that ranged from sympathetic to savage. Harold knew about the post because someone had shown it to him, a volunteer at the church group who thought he deserved to know what people were saying. She had meant well, had wanted to warn him that there was growing pressure on the town council to have him removed. But seeing the words on the screen, reading the cruel jokes and the casual dismissals of his humanity, had wounded Harold in a way that surprised him. He had thought he was beyond caring what strangers thought. He had been wrong. The councilwoman who had led the charge against him was named Victoria Chen, a real estate agent who had lived in Willow Creek for 20 years and considered herself a pillar of the community. She had posted multiple times about the blight in Riverside Park, about the danger that a homeless man and his dog posed to children and property values, about the need for decisive action to protect the town's character. Her posts were careful, never quite crossing the line into outright cruelty, but the message was unmistakable. Harold Whitmore was a problem, and Victoria Chen was determined to solve it. The town council meeting where his fate would be decided was scheduled for a Thursday evening in late October. Harold had no intention of attending, had no desire to sit in a room full of people who saw him as less than human and listen to them debate whether he deserved to exist within their borders. He would find out the decision soon enough, would either be allowed to stay or forced to move on, as he had moved on from so many places before. But Scout had other plans. The morning of the council meeting dawned cold and gray, with a bite in the air that warned of the winter to come. Harold emerged from the hollow of the old oak tree with stiff joints and a cough that had been getting worse over the past week. He knew he needed to see a doctor, knew that whatever was happening in his lungs was probably serious. But doctors cost money, and money was something Harold had precious little of. Scout was already awake, standing at the edge of the hollow, his body tense with an alertness that Harold had learned to respect. The dog's instincts had saved them more than once, warning of dangers that Harold's aging senses couldn't detect. Whatever Scout was focused on, it was worth paying attention to. Harold followed the dog's gaze and saw a girl standing at the edge of the park, perhaps 50 yards away. She was young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with blonde hair and pigtails and a backpack that suggested she was on her way to school. She was standing perfectly still, staring at something in the river that Harold couldn't see from his position. "What is it, boy?" Harold asked, his voice rough from sleep and sickness. "What's going on?" Scout whined softly, a sound that Harold had learned meant concern rather than alarm. The dog took a few steps toward the girl, then looked back at Harold as if urging him to follow. Harold hesitated. His interactions with the townspeople had taught him to keep his distance, to avoid any situation that might be misinterpreted as threatening or inappropriate. Approaching a young girl, even with the best of intentions, was exactly the kind of thing that could land him in trouble. But Scout was insistent, whining louder now, pulling at the leg of Harold's pants with gentle but persistent force. The dog knew something, sensed something, and wanted Harold to act. Harold made his decision. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his back and the tightness in his chest, and followed Scout toward the edge of the park. As they got closer, Harold understood what had captured the girl's attention. There was a boy in the river, a child who couldn't be more than 5 or 6 years old, clinging to a branch that jutted out from the bank. The current was pulling at him, trying to drag him toward the deeper water, where the river's power would overwhelm his small body. He was crying, his voice thin and desperate, calling for help that wasn't coming. The girl on the bank was frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to do anything but watch, as her brother, for that's surely who he was, struggled to hold on.
Harold didn't hesitate. He had seen death too many times to be paralyzed by it, had faced situations far more dangerous than a river in an October morning. He moved toward the bank, assessing the situation with eyes trained by decades of survival. The branch the boy was clinging to looked solid, but the current was strong and the water was cold. Hypothermia would set in quickly, sapping the boy's strength and making it harder for him to hold on.
But before Harold could reach the water, Scout was already in motion.
The dog leaped from the bank with a grace that belied his years, landing in the shallow water near the shore and immediately beginning to paddle toward the struggling child. The current caught him, pushing him downstream, but Scout fought against it with a determination that seemed almost supernatural. He was a strong swimmer, his legs churning through the water, his eyes fixed on the boy with an intensity that spoke of absolute focus. Harold watched in amazement as Scout reached the child and positioned himself beside the branch. The dog seemed to understand exactly what needed to happen. He grabbed the collar of the boy's jacket in his teeth and began to pull, adding his strength to the child's grip on the branch, preventing the current from tearing him away.
But Scout couldn't get the boy to shore alone. The dog was strong, but the current was stronger, and without assistance they would both be swept away into the deeper water, where rescue would become impossible. Harold was in the river before he consciously made the decision, the shock of the cold water driving the breath from his lungs. His back screamed in protest, his chest tightened with a pain that might have been fear or might have been something worse. But he pushed through it, wading toward Scout and the boy with a determination that surprised him.
The water was waist-deep by the time he reached them, the current pulling at his legs, threatening to knock him off balance. He braced himself against the branch and reached for the boy, wrapping his arms around the small body and lifting him clear of the water.
"I've got you," Harold said, his voice barely audible over the rush of the river. "I've got you, son. You're going to be okay."
Scout released his grip on the boy's collar and began paddling toward the shore, leading the way for Harold to follow. The journey back seemed to take forever, each step a battle against the current and the cold that was seeping into Harold's bones. But finally, miraculously, they reached the shallows, and Harold was able to carry the boy onto the bank and set him down beside his sister. The girl was crying now, tears of relief streaming down her face as she threw her arms around her brother. "Tommy, Tommy, I thought you were going to drown." Harold collapsed on the grass beside them, his body shaking from the cold and the exertion, his breath coming in ragged gasps that felt like fire in his lungs. Scout was beside him immediately, pressing his wet body against Harold's, trying to share what warmth he had left. Somewhere in the distance, Harold could hear shouting, could see people running toward them from the direction of the street. Help was coming, finally, drawn by the commotion or by a witness who had called for assistance. Harold didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was that the boy was safe, that Scout had done what needed to be done, that for once in his miserable life he had been in the right place at the right time. The paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by police and a growing crowd of onlookers. Someone wrapped a blanket around Harold's shoulders, asked him questions he couldn't quite process, checked his vital signs with an efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first emergency. Scout was examined too, pronounced healthy despite his swim in the cold water, praised by everyone who saw him for his heroic action. The boy's name was Tommy Chen, Harold learned later. His sister was Emma, and their mother, the woman who arrived at the scene with panic in her eyes and threw herself at her children with a desperation that only a parent could feel, was Victoria Chen. The same Victoria Chen who had led the campaign to drive Harold out of town. The irony was not lost on Harold, though he was too exhausted and too sick to appreciate it. He was loaded into an ambulance despite his protests, his symptoms apparently alarming enough that the paramedics insisted on taking him to the hospital. Scout was not allowed to come, a separation that distressed them both, but a kind volunteer from the crowd promised to care for the dog until Harold was released. The hospital stay lasted 3 days, during which Harold was diagnosed with pneumonia that had probably been developing for weeks and was now life-threatening. He was given antibiotics and oxygen, was hooked up to monitors that beeped and whirred,
was attended by nurses and doctors who treated him with a kindness that seemed out of keeping with everything he had experienced in Willow Creek.
And he had visitors, many visitors.
The first to come was Victoria Chen, arriving on the morning of Harold's second day in the hospital with her children in tow. She looked different from the photograph he had seen on the town's Facebook page, smaller and more vulnerable, her confidence stripped away by the near tragedy that had befallen her family.
"Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice unsteady, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. Tommy was only in the river for a minute before you and your dog reached him, but the doctor said that another minute and he might have—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that had haunted her since the moment she received a call about the accident.
Harold looked at her, this woman who had posted cruel comments about him, who had demanded that he be removed from the town like so much garbage. He could have been angry, could have pointed out the irony, could have reminded her of all the things she had said and done, but he found that he didn't have the energy for anger anymore.
"Scout did all the work," he said. "I just helped at the end. Your boy is safe. That's all that matters." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "But you risked your life. You were sick, we found out later. You could have died in that river. And after everything after what I—" She shook her head, unable to continue.
"We've all done things we're not proud of," Harold said quietly. "Life is hard, and sometimes we take that hardness out on people who don't deserve it. I understand. I really do."
Victoria reached out and took his hand, holding it between both of hers with a gentleness that Harold hadn't experienced in a very long time. "Can you ever forgive me? Can this town ever make up for how we treated you?"
Harold thought about the question for a long moment. The mockery and the cruelty had hurt, there was no denying that. They had made an already difficult life even harder, had stripped away the last vestiges of dignity that he had tried so hard to maintain. But he had learned long ago that carrying grudges was a burden that weighed most heavily on the one who carried them.
"Forgiveness isn't something you ask for," he said finally. "It's something you earn. If you want to make things right, don't do it for me. Do it for the next person who finds themselves in my situation. Do it because it's the right thing to do."
Victoria nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his words. She promised to do better, to be better, to work toward a town that helped those in need, rather than mocking them. Harold didn't know if she meant it, didn't know if the change would last, but he had done what he could, had pointed the way. The rest was up to her.
The other visitors came throughout the day and the days that followed. Members of the church group who had provided meals, strangers who had seen the rescue and wanted to thank him personally, local business owners who offered jobs and housing, and all the things that Harold had been denied for so long. The change in the town's attitude was remarkable, a complete reversal that seemed almost too good to be true.
But the most important visitor was Scout.
The dog was brought to the hospital on the third day, a special exception made by the staff who understood how important the reunion would be. Scout bounded into the room with an energy that belied the ordeal he had been through, leaping onto Harold's bed and covering his face with wet kisses. The nurses pretended to disapprove, but Harold could see them smiling as they watched the reunion.
"Hey, boy," Harold said, wrapping his arms around Scout's neck and holding him close. "Hey, you hero! You saved that little boy. You saved him, and you saved me, too."
Scout's tail wagged furiously, his whole body vibrating with joy at being reunited with his person. The dog didn't understand why they had been separated, didn't understand the complexities of hospitals and policies and human bureaucracy. All he knew was that Harold was here, was alive, was holding him close, and that was enough.
The town council meeting that had been scheduled to discuss Harold's removal from the park was postponed, then canceled entirely. In its place, a new meeting was convened to discuss how Willow Creek could better serve its homeless population, how the community could provide support and dignity to those who had fallen on hard times. Victoria Chen, chastened by her experience, became one of the leading voices for reform. A house was found for Harold, a small cottage on the outskirts of town that had been donated by a local family who wanted to help. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a bathroom, but it was warm and dry and safe. It was more than Harold had had in years, more than he had ever expected to have again. And best of all,
Scout was allowed to stay with him, the faithful companion who had been by his side through everything. The recovery from pneumonia was slow, complicated by decades of neglect and the damage that life on the streets had done to Harold's body. But for the first time in a long time, he had reason to believe that things might get better. He had a home now, a community that had finally accepted him, a dog who loved him unconditionally. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. The story of the rescue spread far beyond Willow Creek, picked up by news outlets that were drawn to the narrative of a homeless veteran and his dog saving a drowning child from the family of his greatest critic. Reporters came to interview Harold, wanting to hear the story in his own words, wanting to understand the man behind the headlines.
Harold was uncomfortable with the attention, had never sought the spotlight, but he understood that the story had power, that it could change how people thought about homelessness and veterans, and the marginalized members of society who were too often invisible.
Scout became famous too, the heroic dog who had jumped into a cold river to save a child he had never met. Pictures of him appeared in newspapers and on websites, his story shared millions of times on social media. A local artist created a portrait that was hung in the town hall, commemorating his courage. And children who had once thrown rocks at the old oak tree now asked their parents if they could meet the dog who had become a hero. The attention brought donations, money, and goods that poured in from around the country to support Harold and others like him. A foundation was established in Scout's name, dedicated to helping homeless veterans find housing and medical care. Victoria Chen, in her ongoing efforts to make amends, became one of the foundation's most active volunteers, using her real estate connections to help find affordable housing for those in need. The old oak tree still stood at the edge of Riverside Park, its hollow now empty, its role as Harold's refuge now just a memory. But the town had installed a plaque at its base, commemorating what had happened there and honoring the man and dog who had called it home. The plaque read, "In honor of Harold Whitmore and Scout, who reminded us that heroism comes in many forms and can be found in the most unexpected places." Harold would walk past the tree sometimes during his daily outings with Scout, would pause and remember those weeks when it had been his only shelter. The memories were not entirely unpleasant now, softened by time and by the knowledge of how things had turned out. He had survived, had found a community that finally accepted him, had been given the chance to live out his remaining years with dignity. That was more than many veterans could say, more than he had ever dared to hope for. The bond between Harold and Scout grew even stronger in the months and years that followed. The dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in their lives, that the constant movement and uncertainty that had characterized their existence was finally over. He settled into the routines of their new life with the contentment of a creature who had finally found his forever home. Harold's health improved with proper care and stable housing, though he would never be fully well again. The years of exposure and neglect had taken their toll, leaving him with lungs that struggled and joints that ached, and a body that reminded him daily of everything it had been through. But he was comfortable now, was cared for, was surrounded by people who saw him as a human being worthy of respect. Victoria Chen became something like a friend, visiting regularly to check on Harold and Scout, bringing her children who had grown attached to the man and dog who had saved Tommy's life. The awkwardness of their first meeting gave way to genuine warmth as they discovered that they had more in common than either had expected. Both knew what it was like to feel alone, to struggle with circumstances beyond their control, to make mistakes that hurt others. That shared understanding formed the basis of a connection that surprised them both. The first anniversary of the rescue was marked by a ceremony in Riverside Park, attended by hundreds of people who wanted to honor Harold and Scout for their heroism. The mayor presented them with a key to the city, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged their place in the community they had been threatened with expulsion from just a year before. Harold accepted the honor with his characteristic humility, deflecting praise toward Scout and toward the people who had helped them rebuild their lives. "A year ago, I was living in a tree and being mocked by this town," Harold said in his brief speech. "Today, I have a home, I have friends, and I have hope for the future. That transformation didn't happen because of anything I did. It happened because a dog jumped into a river to save a child, and because that action reminded everyone that heroism doesn't care about social status or living situation or any of the other things we use to divide ourselves from each other."
He paused, looking down at Scout, who was sitting patiently at his side.
Scout has never cared that I was homeless, that I was poor, that I was sick. He has loved me unconditionally from the moment he found me, and he has never asked for anything in return except the chance to be by my side. That kind of love is rare and precious, and I have been blessed to experience it for these past 6 years.
He looked out at the crowd, at the faces that had once sneered at him and now smiled with genuine warmth.
So thank you. Thank you for giving us a chance. Thank you for seeing past the circumstances to the human being underneath. And thank you for reminding me that people can change, that communities can heal, and that there is always hope, even in the darkest moments.
The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, a far cry from the mockery that had characterized his treatment just a year before. Harold accepted it with grace, then retreated to the edge of the crowd where he could watch the festivities without being at their center. Scout stayed close, as always, the loyal companion who had never wavered in his devotion.
Tommy Chen ran up to them, now a year older and full of the energy that characterized healthy young children. He threw his arms around Scout's neck, hugging the dog who had saved his life with an enthusiasm that made everyone who watched smile.
"I love you, Scout," Tommy said, his voice muffled by the dog's fur. "You're my best friend forever and ever."
Scout's tail wagged in response, his tongue lolling out in the expression of canine happiness that Harold had come to know so well. The dog didn't understand the significance of what had happened, didn't comprehend the way his actions had transformed their lives. But he understood love, understood the joy of being surrounded by people who cared about him. And in the end, perhaps that was all that really mattered.
The years that followed were the happiest of Harold's life, a late-blooming season of peace after decades of struggle. He became a fixture in Willow Creek, known and respected throughout the community, invited to speak at schools and veterans events about his experiences. He told his story honestly, including the dark times, the years of homelessness, the mockery and rejection he had faced. And he told the story of Scout, the dog who had changed everything. The Scout Foundation grew into a significant organization, helping hundreds of homeless veterans find housing and support across the region. Harold served on the board of directors, lending his perspective and his credibility to an organization that bore his dog's name. He never sought personal recognition, always deflecting attention toward the veterans who needed help and the volunteers who provided it. But everyone who worked with the foundation knew that Harold was its heart, the living example of what was possible when a community chose compassion over contempt. Scout began to slow down as the years passed, his muzzle turning white, his movements becoming stiff and careful. Harold watched the changes with the bittersweet awareness of someone who knew that time was running out. The dog who had found him on a rainy night in Memphis, who had followed him across the country, who had jumped into a cold river to save a drowning child, was growing old, and there was nothing Harold could do to stop it. He made the most of every day they had left, taking Scout on gentle walks through the park where they had once lived, sitting together on the porch of their cottage and watching the sunset, sharing meals and naps and all the small moments that made up a life. The love between them had always been strong, but it deepened in these final years, tempered by the awareness that their time together was finite. Scout passed away on a spring morning, 8 years after the rescue that had made him famous. He died in his sleep, lying on his bed beside Harold's chair, his face peaceful and his body still. Harold found him when he woke, and the grief that washed over him was like nothing he had experienced since he had held his dying friends in the jungles of Vietnam. He sat with Scout for a long time, stroking the dog's still fur, remembering all the miles they had traveled together and all the challenges they had overcome. He remembered the night Scout had found him, the way the dog had pressed against his side and refused to leave. He remembered the years of wandering, the cold nights and the hungry days, the way Scout had been his constant companion through it all. And he remembered the river, the moment when Scout had leaped into the water without hesitation to save a child he had never met. "You were the best of us, boy," Harold whispered. "You were the hero. I was just lucky enough to have you by my side." The funeral for Scout was held in Riverside Park, near the old oak tree where they had once made their home. Hundreds of people attended, a testament to the impact the dog had made on the community.
Victoria Chen was there with her children, Tommy, now a teenager, who had never forgotten the dog who had saved his life. Members of the church group were there, the volunteers who had helped Harold through his darkest days. And representatives of the Scout Foundation were there, carrying banners that bore the image of the dog who had inspired their work. Harold spoke at the service, his voice steady despite the tears that streamed down his face. "Scout found me when I was lost," he said. "He stayed with me when everyone else had given up. He saved a child's life when no one else could reach him. And he taught this town, taught all of us, what it means to love without judgment, to serve without expectation, to be brave in the face of danger." He paused, looking at the grave that had been dug near the base of the old oak tree. "I have lived a long life, and I have known many people who called themselves heroes. Soldiers and firefighters and doctors and nurses, people who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. But Scout was the greatest hero I ever knew, because he never thought of himself as a hero at all. He was just a dog, doing what dogs do, loving the people who mattered to him, and protecting them with everything he had." Harold bent down and placed a worn collar on the grave, the collar Scout had worn since the day they found each other. "Rest well, old friend. You've earned it. And thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for everything you gave me. I'll see you again someday, on the other side of the river." The town erected a statue of Scout in the park, a bronze likeness that captured the dog in mid-leap, frozen at the moment when he had plunged into the water to save Tommy Chen. Children loved to climb on it, to pose for photographs beside it, to hear the story of the hero dog who had once lived in the old oak tree nearby. Parents would bring their sons and daughters to see the statue and tell them about Harold and Scout, about the homeless veteran who had been mocked and the dog who had changed everything. Harold lived for another 4 years after Scout's death, passing away peacefully in his cottage at the age of 79. He was buried beside his dog in the plot near the old oak tree that had become a memorial to their remarkable story. The gravestone that was placed over their shared resting place bore an inscription that Harold had chosen himself. "Harold Whitmore and Scout, together again. A veteran and his dog who taught a town the meaning of heroism." The legacy they left behind continued to grow long after they were gone. The Scout Foundation expanded its work, eventually helping thousands of homeless veterans across the country find housing and support. The town of Willow Creek became known as a model for how communities could address homelessness with compassion rather than contempt. And the story of the old oak tree, of the veteran who lived there and the dog who had saved a drowning child, was told and retold through generations. Victoria Chen devoted the rest of her life to the work that Harold and Scout had inspired. She became the chair of the Scout Foundation's board of directors, guiding its expansion and ensuring that its mission stayed true to the values that had defined its founding. On the anniversary of the rescue each year, she would bring her family to the old oak tree and tell them again how close they had come to tragedy, how a homeless man and his dog had been the only ones who could help. "Never judge anyone by where they sleep or what they wear," she would tell her grandchildren when they came along. "You never know who might be a hero in disguise." The statue of Scout became a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by dog lovers and veterans, and anyone who had been touched by the story of the homeless man and his faithful companion. People would leave flowers and toys and notes of gratitude, small offerings that accumulated around the bronze figure and had to be cleared away regularly. Some visitors claimed they could feel something at the site, a presence that was warm and welcoming, as if Scout's spirit still lingered near the tree where he had once lived. The old oak tree itself continued to stand, its massive trunk now bearing a plaque that explained its significance and its history. The hollow where Harold and Scout had once sheltered was still visible, though it had been partially filled with the natural growth of the tree. Children would peer inside it, trying to imagine what it must have been like to live there, to call this small space home when you had nowhere else to go. The story became part of the town's identity, told in schools and at community events, referenced in speeches and articles and local histories. Willow Creek was no longer just a town on a river in an unremarkable part of the country. It was the place where a homeless veteran had been mocked for living in a tree,
where his dog had saved a child's life, where everything had changed in a single moment of courage and compassion.
That transformation was the real legacy of Harold Whitmore and Scout, not the statue or the foundation or the story that was told and retold, but the change in how people saw each other, the recognition that human beings were not defined by their circumstances, the understanding that heroism could come from the most unexpected places. The town that had once mocked a veteran in an old tree had learned to see him as a person worthy of respect, and that lesson, carried forward through generations, would continue to shape how the community treated those who fell on hard times, long after everyone who had witnessed the original events was gone. That is the power of a dog's heroic action. Not just the immediate rescue, the child saved from drowning, but the ripple effects that spread outward through time. The changed hearts, the opened minds, the community transformed by witnessing something that reminded them of the best parts of themselves. Scout never knew the impact he had. He was just a dog, doing what dogs do, loving his person and protecting those in need. But his action on that cold October morning set in motion a chain of events that would touch countless lives, would change how an entire town thought about homelessness and heroism, would create a legacy that would endure for generations. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever place awaits dogs who have earned their rest, Scout is still running, still swimming, still leaping into danger to save those who need saving. He is with Harold again, the two of them reunited after the brief separation that death imposes on those who love each other. They are walking together through fields that never end, through sunshine that never fades, through a peace that was earned through years of struggle and sacrifice. They are home now, truly home, in a way that neither of them ever was during their years together on Earth. The mockery and the hardship and the cold nights in the hollow of an old oak tree are behind them. What remains is the love they shared, the bond that nothing could break, the connection between a man and his dog that transcended circumstances and persisted through everything. That is the true ending of their story. Not the tragedy of their deaths, but the triumph of their lives. The veteran who was mocked found dignity. The dog who was faithful became a hero. And the town that witnessed their story learned something precious about the nature of humanity and the possibility of redemption. The old oak tree still stands in Riverside Park, its branches reaching toward the sky, its hollow still visible at its base. And if you visit it on a quiet morning, when the mist is rising from the river and the world is still and peaceful, you might feel something there, a presence, warm and welcoming, that seems to say, "You are not alone, you are not forgotten." And no matter how hard things get, there is always hope, always the possibility of a dog's heroic action that shocks everyone and changes everything. That is the legacy of Harold Whitmore and Scout. That is what they left behind, and that is what will endure, long after the statue has crumbled and the foundation has been forgotten, and the story has become a legend rather than a memory. Love endures, heroism inspires, and the bond between a man and his dog can change the world.